Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. You won't believe it, there is another fight this weekend, but this one is not complete trash. This one actually has a few good prospects. So without further ado, let's quit the yapping, whip up the fine meal of a recap, whip up the fine meal of a prediction video. And the first two meat sacks we're looking at today is Josefine Lindgren Knutsson versus Julia Polastri. Bizarre names. Being a female and your last name is Knutsson is rough. I can see why she got into fighting. Josefine made her pro debut all the way back in 2021. She won all of her fights by decision and one fight by TKO in the second round. She first fought under the UFC banner on Road to the UFC Singapore, however, she did not get signed. Then, she fought on Dana White's Contender Series in 2023 and made her official debut in September of last year. She also trains at a fantastic gym, All Stars. Chimaev trains there, Gustafsson trains there, and she's still only 28 years old. Julia Pastore, I'll call her Pastry. Julia Pastry is the only 26-year-old, no, she is only 26 years old with 15 professional fights. Very impressive. And she made her pro debut back in 2017. She has a 58% finish rate, 4 by knockout, 3 by submission, and 4 by decision, which is pretty good for WMMA. She fought on Dana White's Contender Series 2 times, lost the first time to a now prospect, Jasmine Jasudavicius, and won her second opportunity on the show by rear naked choke in 2023. Her only 3 losses have been by decision, and overall, I think I'm gonna pick Julia. She has a great chance of finding the submission, and she's dealt with controversy before, and Josefine has that undefeated confidence coming into it. However, Josefine knows how to win a decision and get the judges on her side, but Julia could 100% sync up a tight choke and get the sub. This fight is pretty interesting, but as always, I'm going to lean towards the finisher, which in this case is Julia Pastry. Next up on the block, we got Jeka Saragih versus Westin Wilson. Jeka is only 29 years old with a total of 17 fights, 14 wins, 3 losses. He made his pro debut back in 2016. His weakness is definitely on the ground. He's lost 2 times by submission. However, he has won 9 fights by knockout and 4 fights by submission. So he is relatively well-rounded. He also fought on the road to the UFC and lost his debut to Anshul Jubilee, but had a pretty impressive knockout win in the first round, 1 minute and 21 seconds in his most recent fight against Lucas Alexander. Westin Wilson is 35 years old, so he is a bit long in the tooth, and he is extremely tall for 145 at a whopping 6'1". He has 16 wins, 9 losses. He has been knocked out 3 times, however, he's won 11 fights by submission, and he made his pro debut in 2014, and his amateur debut in 2012. However, he is currently on a 2-fight losing streak. He has been KO'd in the first round by both guys on this losing streak, and his most recent fight was against Silva in January, and to make it worse, he has yet to win a fight in the UFC. Right now, I'm 100% leaning towards Jeka to get the KO. Westin Wilson doesn't seem to be good enough to hang with the guys on the big stage. Jeka has the youth, the power, and the confidence on his side, so I'm picking Jeka by the first round knockout, and Westin Wilson will probably be cut from the promotion. Next up, we got Carli Judice versus Gabriella Fernandes. Carli started her pro debut less than 2 years ago, in October of 2022, and one of her amateur fights is listed ending in 0.00 of round 1. Which I can only assume means that she was so intimidating that her opponent was petrified and had a panic attack less than a second before the fight. All of her fights ended in TKO in the first round, and her first fight under the UFC banner was a controversial split decision against Ernesta Karakite and she trains out of Lafayette, Louisiana, one of the best places to be born for MMA. Dustin Poirier and DC are both from there, plus she's probably funny because Theo Vaughn is from there, and Carli Judice is aiming to be put onto that list. Very interesting prospect. The only downside is her lack of experience, with only being 25 years old and 4 fights in. Gabriella Fernandes is 30 years old, has a record of 8 wins, 3 losses, and all 3 of her losses have been by decision. She has a finishing rate of 63%, and her very first professional fight was in 2018, and she KO'd Yasmin Lucindo in the very first round. Which, if you don't know who Lucindo is, she's been making waves in the UFC herself, so that's a great one to have in your very first professional fight. However, she has yet to win on the UFC stage. In my opinion, this is an interesting matchup. Both ladies have had little experience, but both ladies get finishes when they win. I think this will be a fun fight, but I am picking Carli Judice to win because of her youth, and she knocks people out. However, Gabby Fernandes could get the job done, but she hasn't yet to do that on the UFC stage. And next up, we got Josh Quinlan versus Adam Fugitt. Josh Quinlan made his pro debut all the way back in 2019, got signed to the UFC in 2021 off of a no contest on Dana White's Contender Series, then went on to win his UFC debut and ended up losing his next 2 fights against Trey Waters and Danny Barlow. However, he is a man known for getting finishes with a 100% finish rate, in his wins of course, but his losses are rough. 1 by KO in the 3rd round and 1 decision loss, leaving his record of 6 wins and 2 losses. And Adam Fugitt is a bit long in the tooth, being 35 years old, but a rough record of 9 wins and 4 losses. He made his pro debut back in 2016 and lost to Austin Vanderford, also known as Austin Van Zandt, Paige Van Zandt's husband. He made his UFC debut in 2022, losing it by TKO in the 3rd round. In his next fight, he scored an impressive knockout in the 1st round, took a loss to Mike Mallet by submission, which has not aged well. On the bright side, he has an impressive 89% finish rate and a 75% finish rate in his losses. Overall, I think this will be a fun scrap between 2 lower level fighters. Josh has potential and has the power on his side, but has taken a few losses that haven't aged well. Same with Adam Fugitt, and the loser will probably get cut, but I think this will end with Quinlan getting a knockout in the 2nd round after a hard-fought 1st round. Jimmy Flick versus Nathan Maness. Jimmy Flick is 33 years old, so he is a bit old to be considered a prospect, but he is a pretty one-dimensional fighter with 15 out of his 17 wins, and the other 2 being a decision. So he has 15 wins by submission, with 7 losses. He made his pro debut back in 2010. His 7 losses do him 0 favors because 6 of them have been by way of knockout. He is 2-2 in the UFC and fought Chris Gutierrez in the XFL in 2018, but it was a TKO due to leg kicks. Being 14 years in and still only focusing on BJJ doesn't give me any hope that he will get any better on the feet. Nathan Maness made his pro debut back in 2013, and he fought Taylor Lapilus before either of them were in the UFC, but it was a loss via TKO. He is 4-2 in the UFC with 2 knockouts and 1 sub and 1 decision under the UFC banner. Overall, he has a record of 15 wins, 3 losses, and a finishing rate of 60%. His 3 losses have been 1 by knockout, 1 by sub, and 1 by decision. Overall, I am picking Maness to get the job done by KO in round 1. Jimmy Flick doesn't seem to be very durable, and as shown, he has a tough time getting his opponents to the ground, and I think that'll be the problem in this fight for him as well. I think he's going to get knocked out cold again. Next up, we have one of the best fights on the card. Not the best, but it's up there. Tagir Ulanbekov versus Joshua Van. Tagir Ulanbekov made his pro debut way back in 2013. He has been dominant in the UFC with a 4-1 record under the UFC banner, and his only loss was to Tim Elliott by decision which isn't anything to scoff at. Tim is a beast. Tagir also has a great record of 15 wins, 2 losses, and has a finishing rate of 60%, and 8 of those wins have been by submission. He is in his physical prime, with him being only 32 years old, and he trains out of Khabib's gym, and also Islam's gym. So he has a fantastic gym and fantastic coaches. Joshua Van is a very young prospect, being only 22 years old, and he made his debut in 2021. He has only 1 loss out of his 11 fights. He is undefeated in the UFC, winning all 3 of his fights, and he has shown extremely good timing on the feet and great takedown defense. 80% of his fights have been finishes, and only 1 loss was a submission back in 2021. Overall, this will be a tough fight for both guys. Joshua Van could definitely get a decision win, but Tagir has great coaches and more experience. I want Joshua Van to win because I'm a huge fan, but I think Tagir will win by decision, but it'll be a huge test for both guys, with Tagir fighting a young up-and-comer with a ton of momentum. It'll be a giant test for Josh Van, fighting a legit fighter with real deal experience and a fantastic ground game. This will not be a fight that anybody will want to miss. Brady Hiestand versus Garrett Armfield. Brady is a young prospect at only 25 years of age. However, he made his pro debut back in 2018, so he has 6 years of experience. He also fought on TUF and lost his debut to Ricky Tercios in a controversial split decision, but he is back in the win column, winning his next 2 fights. However, he lost his last fight by TKO. Overall, he has a record of 7 wins, 3 losses, and a 72% finish rate, and his 2 losses have been by way of 1 knockout and 1 decision loss. Garrett Armfield is also a pretty young fighter, being 27 years old. He made his pro debut in 2018 as well. His first loss was to a guy who is currently in the UFC, and that is Ronnie Lawrence. He lost to him by decision. Garrett was thrown to the wolves in his UFC debut against David Onama, and he lost by submission, but he went on a 2-fight win streak, having a great win over Brad Katona by unanimous decision, and he has a record of 10 wins, 3 losses, and a finishing rate of 80%. In his wins and 3 of his losses have been 2 by submission and 1 decision loss. Overall, I think Garrett will get the job done. He has fought a much tougher competition and has power in his hands, considering he has a knockout rate of 60%. It doesn't help that Brady has been knocked out in the past, and I think Garrett will get the job done by knockout before we'll go with round 2. Next up, we have Azu Almabayev versus Jose Johnson. Azu is only 30 years old, so he is just entering his physical prime. He made his pro debut back in 2013, and he took a loss to Tagir Ulanbekov by TKO in 2017. He is new to the UFC, with this being his 3rd fight. However, he has a huge win over Odie Osborne and CJ Vergara. His record is 19 wins, 3 losses, and has a finishing rate of 63%, and has been KO'd 1 time and lost a fight by decision. Now we'll look at Jose Johnson. He is also entering his physical prime, with him being 29 years old, and he fought Charles Energy Johnson in the amateurs, but he lost by unanimous decision. Made his pro debut in 2016. He fought on Dana White's Contender Series 2 times, and his first fight on the show was a loss to Ronnie Lawrence 2020, and he won his next shot against Jack Cartwright. Then, he lost his UFC debut to Damon Blackshear, but he is coming off of a submission win. Overall, his record isn't very good, being a 50-50 fighter with 16 wins, 8 losses, but he does have a 69% finishing rate in his wins, and 66% of his losses have been by getting finished, 4 of them being by submission, so he is quite literally a killer be killed fighter. With that being said, I think this will be a layup for Azu Almabayev. Say that name 3 times fast. But Azu will submit Jose in the 2nd round, or maybe even the 3rd round. but Jose is a very tough fighter, so it might end up going to the judges. I don't think that's very likely because Jose Johnson has been submitted in half of his losses. Next up, we have Douglas Da Silva versus Miles Johns. Da Silva is on the latter half of his career, being 38 years old, but he is an experienced veteran. That is no easy fight for anyone. He made his UFC debut, or his pro debut, not UFC, way back in 2007. He was undefeated once he entered the UFC, and he took his first loss in his UFC debut against Zabira Turkugov by unanimous decision in 2014. He did get right back on the win column by beating Cody Gibson, and his next loss was against Rob Font. And he has a very impressive win that has aged beautifully in Marlon Chito Vera. His next loss was to Peter Yan due to doctor stoppage. Then he beat a legend in Renan Barao. Then he lost to current prospect and up-and-comer Lerone Murphy. Won 2 fights, then lost another fight to a current phenom, Said Nurmagomedov. And then he beat Cody Seaman is the meme I've been seeing. 2023, leaving his record at 29 wins, 5 losses, and he has an astounding 20 KOs in his career and 7 decision wins. His 5 losses have been 1 by knockout, 1 by submission, and 3 decision losses. He may be old, but he runs through everyone who isn't an absolute savage. Notice the names he's lost to. He's lost to Piotr Yan, Turkugov, Owen Murphy, and Said Nurmagomedov. But he's beaten some real deal guys like Marlon Vera, Cody Seaman, and a couple other guys I can't remember. But this guy is underrated. Next up, hold on. Da Silva honestly might be one of the toughest gatekeepers the UFC has to offer. Miles Johns is entering his physical prime, being only 30 years old. He made his pro debut back in 2014. He has a very impressive win over a young Adrian Yanez, although it was a split decision win, so it wasn't very dominant. However, he got signed to the UFC when he fought on the Dana White's Contender Series as well. Won his debut, but he lost to Mario Batista in 2020. Then he won 2, and then he lost to John Castaneda in 2022, and then he had a no contest against Dan Argueta in 2023. And he came back into the win column with a win over Cody Gibson in March of this year. He has a record of 14 wins and 2 losses, but 57% of his wins have been by decision, and he hasn't been finished in either of his losses. Overall, I think Da Silva will get a very impressive win over Johns, and remind people that he is no joke. He has the experience on his side, and he is extremely tough, as well as that 20 knockout, or he has those 20 knockouts on his record. And I think Miles Johns is going to be put onto that list. Next up, we got Timothy Cuamba versus Lucas Almeida. Timothy is a very young fighter, being only 25 years old, and he made his pro debut back in 2020. Then, he fought on Dana White's Contender Series and won. However, he did not get signed. But he lost his debut in February of this year in a split decision. Overall, he has 8 wins, 2 losses with a 50% finish rate. His losses have came 1 by decision and 1 submission loss. And Lucas Almeida is in his physical prime, being 33 years old. However, the decline is near. He made his pro debut back in 2014, got a shot at a UFC contract on Dana White's Contender Series. However, he lost to Daniel Zellhuber by unanimous decision, and got a shot on the big stage a year later. And he won that opportunity against Michael Trezano and won by TKO. However, he has been on the decline ever since, losing to Pat Sabatini and Andre Fili, being knocked out by Fili and submitted by Pat. He has a decent record of 14 wins, 3 losses, with a 100% finishing rate in his wins, and in his losses, he has been finished 2 times, and the only time his fight has went to the decision, he has lost. So he's another kill or be killed fighter. This fight is honestly a gamble with both guys being on the come up, but I think Timothy will get the job done. And once it gets into the second or the third round, Timothy will break away because Lucas doesn't have the gas tank, and I don't think that Lucas will be the first to knock out Timothy. Not to mention, Timothy is 25, and he still has major room for improvements in his game. Ikram Aliskerov versus Antonio Trocoli. Ikram is an extremely highly touted prospect on the come-up. He is just entering his physical prime, being 31 years old. He made his pro debut back in 2012. His only loss in his whole career has been to Hamza Chimaev in 2019. That was outside of the UFC. He got KO'd in the first round, and he also fought a UFC guy before the UFC, and that was Denis Tiuliulin, but he beat Tiuliulin. He got signed to the UFC after running through his opponents on Dana White's Contender Series with a sub 2 minutes into the first round. Then he smoked Phil Hawes in his debut 2 minutes into the first round by knockout, and then he smoked Warley Alves with a flying knee again in 2 minutes of the very first round. He has a great record of 15 wins, 1 loss, and that only loss has been to Hamza Chimaev. So he's only lost to the best of the best and one of the best fighters the division has to offer. On top of all of that, he has a finishing rate of 73%. Now we're going to take a gander at Antonio Trocoli. Antonio is in his physical prime, being 33 years old. He made his pro debut on Dana White. He made his pro debut in 2013. He also fought Diego Lima, but he lost by UD before the UFC. But he had a shot at a contract on Dana White's Contender Series and won in the first round with a submission. But he failed the drug test, getting his win overturned and being cut by the UFC as punishment. However, he got a few wins, and now he is back in the UFC, and he is being fed to the wolves. In his official UFC debut, he has a record of 12 wins, 3 losses. His finishing percentage is 67%, and he has been knocked out 1 time, and the other 2 losses have been by decision. Overall, I think Ikram is going to run through Trocoli like a hot knife through butter. Bet the house on Ikram, because he is going to smoke this druggie in the very first round, and he will be cut from the UFC again. And next up, we have the main event. Honestly, the best fight on this card, Alex Perez versus Tatsuro Taira. Tatsuro Taira is a Japanese Giga Chad who will tap you out and then chin check the daylights out of you. He is a time traveler coming back from the 1940s to change the opinions of the world on Japan, from being anime weebs to a no-nonsense Sigma Chad. Tatsuro Chad is 24 years old. He made his pro debut in 2018. He got signed to the UFC after going 10-0 on the regional scene. Then he made his UFC debut 2022 and won by decision. Then he smoked CJ Figueroa with an armbar, beat little boy Edgar in a decision. Then he flatlined Carlos Hernandez less than a minute into round 2. Tatsuro Chad's record is a perfect 15-0 with a 74% finish rate at flyweight, with only 4 fights going to a decision. They've all been a unanimous decision, absolute domination. Now we have Alex Perez. He is a very seasoned veteran. He made his pro debut way back in 2011. Then he was showcased under the UFC banner on Season 1 of Dana White's Contender Series. Pulled off the legendary Anaconda choke less than 3 minutes into round 1, 2017. Then he was running through the UFC fighters until he ran into UFC legend Joseph Benavidez, and he got KO'd in round 1, or he got knocked out by Joseph Benavidez in round 1. Then he went on a 3-fight win streak, but then he ran into the God of War, Davison Figueiredo. He got choked out in the very first round. And then he ran into future champion Alejandro Pantoja, and he also got choked out by a neck crank in round 1. And then he ran into UFC prospect and probably a future champion in Muhammad Mokaev, and he lost by unanimous decision. But then, just 2 months ago, he smoked Mateus Nicolau by knockout in round 2. He is now 25 wins with 8 losses. Unfortunately, he has been finished in 74% of his losses and finished 52% in his wins. And now he is facing another young UFC prospect in Tatsuro Taira. I think it goes without saying who I'm picking in this matchup. Tatsuro Chad is going to run through Alex Perez. Tatsuro finishes people and Alex Perez gets finished. And I predict Tatsuro will get the job done in no more than 3 rounds. He will piece him up on the feet, sync up a nasty submission in round 3. Overall, I think this card is underrated, but there are a lot of fighters who are prospects on this card, with most of them having good finishing potential. And this card may not have a lot of name value, but it's definitely not a card you are going to want to miss. And as always, if you've watched the video this far, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you guys enjoyed the fights this Saturday.